Anti-Imperialism, Bankruptcy of the Left by Christoph Fringeli. I just got done exercising, so I'm out of breath. Had to exercise the nerves out before I started reading. It's a tale from another century, when most people who situated themselves on the radical left also felt they were part of a world civil war. It was a war between good and evil, the oppressed versus the oppressors, the proletariat versus the capitalists, the countries of the periphery versus the center, support for anti-colonial struggles and for the Viet Cong, as well as for the various Latin American guerrillas, was based on a wide consensus, and was in many cases the starting point of individual and collective politicizations. This consensus seemed to override the knowledge and assessments of the crimes of Stalin and Mao, and many other, quote, details. Apparently the way towards socialism was not a straight road. It could be a zigzag at times. The more the Western proletariat seemed uninterested in revolution, and the Eastern Bloc seemed a bureaucratic aberration, the more the national liberation movements in the so-called backward countries became the global hope of Western middle-class revolutionaries, in quotes, quote revolutionaries. The root of this idea goes back to the Conference of Baku in 1920 and the Second Congress of the Communist International in the same year. This is when Lenin revised the Marxist slogan, "Workers of all countries unite," and changed it to "Workers and oppressed peoples and nations of the world unite." This slogan significantly changed the direction of the official communist movement. Workers are members of a class and at the same time individual human beings. In oppressed peoples and nations, the individuals are absent. In point 11 of his preliminary draft of Theses on the National and Colonial Questions, Lenin proclaimed that communist parties in, quote, backward states and nations in which the feudal or patriarchal peasant relations predominate must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement, end quote. But at least Lenin recognized some of the dangers and stressed the, quote, need for struggle against the clergy and other influential reactionary and medieval elements, end quote, as well as the, quote, need to combat the pan-Islamic and similar trends which strive to combine the liberation movement against European and American imperialism with an attempt to strengthen the position of the khans, landowners, mullahs, etc., end quote. This advice was heeded less and less as the Soviet Union degenerated, and in fact even less so by those who accused the Soviet Union of, quote, social imperialism and supported a Maoist alternative to the Russian line, supporting shameless nationalist dictatorships with a communist cloak in Albania, Kampuchea, I should know how to say that, or North Korea. But there are other strains of anti-imperialism. The German competition with the British Empire was the beginning of its own anti-imperialist ideology, which later manifested itself in National Socialism and other strains that promoted a combination of national and social, quote, revolution. National revolutionaries of the 20s and 30s, such as Arthur Moeller, Vanderbroek, or Ernst Niekisch, proclaimed anti-imperialist, quote, theories of the rising, quote, young or, quote, proletarian nations opposed to the old and decadent, quote, West. This was a twisted view after all. The United States was arguably a younger nation, if you want to look at things like that for the sake of argument, than Prussia, which most of these authors admired. But of course these authors would deny that the U.S. was a nation at all. Instead it was seen as a racial melting pot, a construct controlled by finance capital and a plutocratic elite. This kind of anti-imperialism is nothing but the, quote, foreign policy version, end quote, of fascist anti-capitalism. An anti-capitalism that is not concerned with the elements that actually constitute capitalism: wage labor, private ownership of the means of production, commodity fetishism, etc. Instead, this fascist anti-capitalism prefers a conspiratorial view of a cabal of super powerful secret forces who have nothing else in mind than to suck the blood out of productive people. Living labor mysteriously disappears into incomprehensible financial derivatives. Of course, this, quote, German version isn't limited to Germany. Quite on the contrary, it's getting more popular wherever, quote, disadvantaged nations are about to become failed states, when capitalism is sliding into crisis. A third closely related type of anti-imperialism is the Islamist jihadist type. Here, elements of classic anti-colonialism converge with a religious blood and soil ideology. Quote, Arab soil is seen as violated by Jewish and Western intruders. But beyond getting rid of them, at best tolerating them as dhimmis, and recapturing Quds, Jerusalem, I guess that's how you say that. Not Jerusalem, the first part, Quds. The aim is to establish a caliphate, either regional or worldwide, depending on which strain of Islam. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and most of the erstwhile national liberation movements, quote, forgot their pretenses of social liberation, but not necessarily the anti-imperialist rhetoric, these types of anti-imperialism got conflated. The left at large has failed to clearly see and criticize the reactionary, even fascist aspects of many of these movements, especially when they seem to have the same enemies: colonialism and imperialism. It was the World Trade Center attack that greatly confused a large section of the left, since it was done with some aims in the mind that the left usually claimed as their own. It was done by Islamo-fascists with the explicit aim of attacking and destroying, quote, crusaders and Jews, end quote. Brushing aside this reality, Western left-wing intellectuals were quick to laying the blame on America itself. Apparently, America's imperialist politics had sown what the collapsing towers were the harvest of. Other sections escaped into mushrooming conspiracy theories, putting the blame back into the same court, but this time insinuating that the Bush government had advanced knowledge, if not even a hand in the proceedings, and gladly had the towers destroyed so they would get carte blanche to set up a, quote, tyrannical regime at home and increase the pressure on their imperialist foreign policy on the rest of the world. These positions made it possible for significant sections of the left to maintain their own anti-imperialist ideology, rather than scrutinize it. These positions made it possible for significant sections of the left to maintain their own anti-imperialist ideology rather than having to scrutinize their own anti-imperialist ideology. Equally, the solidarity of most of the international left with the Second Intifada, started by Arafat in 2000, remained unchanged. Again, contrary to historical fact, the blame was shifted from the Palestinian leadership to Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount as the reason for the bloody events ensuing. The eagerness of the left to side with them seems strange, insofar that by this point most of the Palestinian groups had given up any pretense of social liberation which they had propagated in the times of the Cold War. So the left managed to hold on to some of its key positions that are also occupied by ultra-reactionary religious groups and explicit fascists through a simple strategy of denial. The left looks only on one side, the United States and Israel, and does not analyze the position of the others, Islamo-fascism, Arab nationalism, the Palestinian leadership, and sometimes even goes so far as to denounce some of them for example, Al-Qaeda as a U.S. construct. This situation could only worsen as America planned to strike back. While few had the nerve to come out with ludicrous slogans such as "Victory to Afghanistan," Newsline London, the daily paper of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, in one of their editions in the early days of the war against the Taliban regime, Newsline London, the Newsline is the daily paper of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. In one of their editions in the early days of the war against the Taliban regime, the peace demonstrations attracted an increasingly varied mixture of people. This became much more acute during the campaigns against the Iraq War. Everybody agreed that the war against Iraq had to be averted. The left, the neo-Nazis, official Germany and France, the whole of the Islamic world, from Arab nationalism to Islamic fundamentalists, the Vatican. This unappetizing coalition unfolded remarkable activities, essentially on behalf of the Ba'ath Party regime in Baghdad. Within the left, views range from the Ba'ath Party is fascist and should be toppled, but by Iraqis and not by Americans, to Saddam is a great anti-imperialist and should be supported against the U.S. The range already makes it questionable to talk of the, quote, left. The ensuing exchange of ideas and the essential unity of action by some sections of the radical left, with some sections of the radical right, demands further scrutiny. Is there actual collaboration, or are there just incidental parallels between two otherwise incompatible camps? Indeed, open collaboration is, so far, relatively rare. But we will see that the underlying ideology is in many cases far closer than many involved would like to admit. And once they can admit it, the obstacles to a united front are fast disappearing. For many years, only obscure Strasserite sects were openly advocating a national socialism with elements of both spectra, such as the KDS, Kampfbund Deutscher Sozialisten, fighting union of German socialists in Germany. This has been reinforced in the last few years, on the one hand, through the migration of some formerly high-profile left-wing figures like Horst Mahler, Bernd Rabel, and others to the fascist right, and on the other hand with the influx of ideas from the French Nouvelle Droite into the mainstream as well. Apparently, sections of the left, as well into the mainstream as well as apparently sections of the left. When KDS, Fighting Union of German Socialists, was referring to their solidarity with, quote, friends from Iraq, from Cuba, the Palestinians, the PLO, the PFLP, but also the people of North Korea, because what is decisive is only National Socialism is international, end quote. They were by no means alone. Prominent on the far left is the Anti-Imperialist Coordination, an organization mainly based in Italy and Austria. At an annual anti-imperialist camp, meetings are held and campaigns planned and coordinated, such as the 10 euros for the Iraqi resistance campaign. One statement on their website declared pompously, "There are struggles which mark epochs. Today it is on the soldiers of the Iraqi people to defend the front lines separating freedom from tyranny. We will support them in every possible way for freedom and self-determination of Iraq, and for the defeat of imperialist tyranny throughout the world," end quote. The tasks of resistance supporters. November 10th, 2005, resolution approved by the International Gathering in Rome, October 2nd, 2005. It's only consequent that the same site features an interview with Hamas leader under the title Together Against Imperialism. It's also only logical that a book titled Ami Go Home, authored by one Wilhelm Langthaler of the AIK and Werner Perker, notorious for his anti-Zionist agitation in the Stalinist daily paper Jungewelt. Has in turn received a glowing review in the Deutsche Stimme, the paper of the neo-Nazi NPD. An increasing number of similar initiatives combining romantic anti-capitalism with the fanatical anti-imperialism of left and right have surfaced in the last few years. Not that this is a new phenomenon as such. We can trace it at least back to the 2000s, but recently it has gained a virulence that third positionists in the 1990s could only have dreamt of. Obvious extremists such as the KDS or the AIK are only the tip of the iceberg of a phenomenon that now permeates large segments of European society. More and more radical anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism in red, brown, and green variations, and an increasing preparedness to either openly set aside other differences to seek a united front, or, more commonly, simply deny or ignore the partners in the pursuit of attacking the common enemy. Quote, "The key factor in politics today, nationally and internationally, is resistance and opposition to the occupation of Iraq," end quote. The British Socialist Workers' Party declared in their conference resolution from 6th to 8th of January 2006. This Trotskyist party is notorious for its attempts to capitalize on any popular movement that would seem to bring their agenda ahead. Indeed, their January 2006 conference resolution is called "Building the SWP in the Age of Mass Movements." The mass movements referred to are likely to be the anti-globalization and peace movements. The Socialist Workers' Party was also initially largely behind the party Respect, which stood in the 2005 general elections and managed to win one seat with George Galloway, the former Labour MP, a fervent anti-Zionist and supporter of Saddam Hussein. George Galloway belonged to the set of politicians who visited the dictator during the sanctions, along with Austrian far-right politician Jörg Haider, French far-right leader Jean-Marie Le Pen, and his wife, as well as a delegation of the KDS, and many others, including French politicians from the governing UMP, Chirac's party. Galloway, Haider, Le Pen, and other supporters of the Ba'ath regime have also in common that they are desperate to appear as, quote, "great men," end quote, with historical importance. Thus they bathe in the sun of the fascist dictator. They are also willing to go to considerable lengths just to be in the public eye. For example, Galloway was taking part in the TV program Celebrity Big Brother, the proceeds of which, £60,000 fee, and estimated £100,000 from text messages, he was donating to Interpol. The organization is registered as a charity in the UK, but has been listed as a terrorist organization by the United States. Galloway lost his seat in 2010, but managed to get elected again in a by-election in Bradford West in 2012, a city he declared to be an Israel-free zone in 2014. His track record of, quote, anti-Zionist behavior is one of the worst of a British person of his level of public stature, yet he's concerned with denying the obvious. In fact, when Hadley Freeman, a columnist for The Guardian, tweeted, quote, "Galloway has said and done things that cross the line from anti-Israel to anti-Semitic," end quote, Galloway proceeded to have his lawyers threaten legal action and even demand an apology and £5,000, each from people who retweeted Freeman's tweet. No action was taken in the end. Instead, his law firm was issued a warning from the Solicitors Regulation Authority. A bad loser at any account, and a narcissist to boot, Galloway also publicly challenged the election result in 2015 when he lost his seat to the Labour candidate. Again, no legal steps were taken. Next, Galloway stood for the post of London Mayor on the 5th of May 2016, receiving only 1.4% of the vote. Briefly, back in 2003, the Iraqi dictator received support from the European far right clearly makes sense. His Ba'ath Party, founded by Michel Aflaq in the 30s, was modeled on the fascist parties, and the, quote, Arab socialism they preached was based on German National Socialism. Saddam himself was a fervent admirer of both Hitler and Stalin. The country was ruled with incredible brutality. Tens of thousands were murdered. Torture and executions were the order of the day. How then was it possible that the mobilizations to avert a war against such a regime reached the vast proportions they did? It's worth mentioning in passing that French President Chirac had won a huge majority over the far-right candidate Le Pen in the presidential elections, and that the German Chancellor Schroeder, to a large degree, managed a re-election in 2002 due to his anti-American stance. But these were not just election maneuvers. European investment banked on the status quo in countries like Iraq and Iran, no matter what the political situation was, and also the massive European Union investments into the Palestinian Authority that, along with ample donations by Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, made Arafat an extremely rich man and helped make his, quote, insurrection against Israel possible. An attempt by MEP Ilka Schroeder to shed some light on the trail of money originating from the European Union and ending in the war chest of anti-Semitic terror organizations was essentially blocked by the European Union. It wasn't until after Arafat's death that a clearer picture would emerge. Namely, there existed no accountability in bookkeeping. The boundaries between the finance of the PA and of Arafat's personal matters were blurred, to say the least. PA being the Palestinian Authority. All handouts, cash, and checks were issued by the leader himself, often to buy loyalties of the various armed and political factions, and not without funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into bank accounts and investments abroad, including a $100,000 a month to $100,000. All handouts, cash, and checks were issued by the leader himself, often to buy loyalties of the various armed and political factions, and not without funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into bank accounts and investments abroad, including $100,000 a month to finance his wife's lavish lifestyle in Paris. It seems mysterious that this man was seen as a hero by many people who considered themselves to be on the side of progress and emancipation. Equally mysterious is the support that some are currently giving to Putin, Assad, and Iran. Putin, in turn, is supporting the far right in Europe. Assad's torture squads are renowned for their extreme brutality, and Iran has imprisoned, tortured, and executed tens of thousands of communists and other left-wingers opposing the Islamist regime. One possible interpretation of these sympathies is the vulgar theory derived from the social democratic theorist Karl Kautsky that capitalism develops towards a kind of super-imperialism. This, quote, this theory is rolled out regularly by the left and the far left of capital, the better to chain the workers to, quote, their national state against, quote, worldwide capitalism, end quote, and, quote, non-national bodies like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, multinational corporations, etc., as the International Communist Current put it. This, quote, super-imperialism is generally identified with the United States, which is identified with globalization, which in turn is often equated with, quote, Americanization. Where's my coffee? The resulting anti-imperialism has a tendency to support or tolerate any movement that is at odds with the perceived enemy. It is thus becoming the rallying cry for any sort of nationalism and all sorts of fundamentalist movements directly opposed to enlightenment and bourgeois democracy, as much as to social liberation and communist universal emancipation. The ultra-left analysis is correct in pointing out that the rivalries between the different factions of the international bourgeoisie to understand a lot of the drift against the United States as an attempt by the European and Arab ruling classes to position themselves to their advantage in the imperialist competition and to view anti-imperialism as a mobilizing tool to tie the working classes to the various local elites against a powerful foreign enemy. While certainly being the case in Europe, this is particularly true for Islamic countries, especially the ones with domestic, economic, and political problems. However, this analysis usually overlooks one important element that glues the different anti-imperialist camps together: anti-Semitism. Let me get my coffee real quick. Pardon me, folks. All right, friends. Let's talk about anti-Semitism. While anti-Semitism has never completely disappeared, it certainly has had a big resurgence since 9/11. This is one of the aspects where the calculation of the attackers has clearly worked, since the attack on the World Trade Center was consciously planned as an attack on global finance capital. In the mind of the anti-Semite, global finance capital is always imagined to be run by, quote, the Jews. The prominent unifying factor in the red-brown-green front is the, quote, politically correct form, end quote, of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and hatred against the United States. Anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism are closely tied together. Some from this coalition often describe the neoconservatives around Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl to be like a group of latter-day elders of Zion, manipulating American foreign policy in the interest of Israel. Both countries are seen not as, quote, real nations, but as, quote, constructs that lack the blood ties of a, quote, people. The attention given to the conflicts in Israel-Palestine and the hatred poured upon Israel is disproportional, to say the least, and its fanaticism is remarkable. This is not only the case with neo-Nazi boot boys, but equally with members of the lefty intelligentsia. But it doesn't make sense anymore to equate the far right with violent skinheads, although they will still do the job of inflicting physical harm. Many publicists on the right have resorted to a strategy of attacking Zionism rather than Jews, and quoting writers of Jewish descent, such as Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, to back up their arguments. This is particularly popular in the context of Holocaust revisionism, for which both these authors have done invaluable services. Finkelstein construes a Holocaust industry whereby he is not denying the reality of the Shoah, but claims that it is primarily instrumentalized by the, quote, Jewish establishment to serve their current political and economic interests. This is now practically serving as a, quote, politically correct starting point for some Holocaust revisionists. Their reasoning, in quotes, suggests that if the Holocaust has mainly become a tool, then wouldn't those who use it exaggerate a little bit or worse? Chomsky, on the other hand, has publicly defended the right of revisionists to voice their opinion, and even wrote the introduction to Robert Farrison's book Memoir in Defense. I don't know what that is, but I'm reading, so I don't have time to look it up. The Iranian government has aggressively embraced the case of Holocaust revisionism as a weapon in Iran's war against Israel by announcing a, quote, scientific conference. Among the invites were Horst Mahler, Robert Farrison, and Israel Shamir, living proof that people of Jewish descent can be anti-Semites. These various elites cooperate with each other in the, quote, war to extermination against Israel, a country described as a, quote, apartheid regime, and the, quote, colonialist bridgehead of imperialism, end quote, and its supporter, the, quote, Great Satan, USA, the cosmopolitan, multicultural, and mixed-race giant that is out to rule the world and destroy the authenticity of local cultures with its globalization. Official Europe's indifference has been tested by the, at least publicly increased, radicalism of Iran under Ahmadinejad and election victory of Hamas in Gaza in 2006. While France was still embracing Hezbollah in Lebanon, Germany was a bit less spectacular in its official embracing of the theocratic and fascist regimes in the Middle East. However, almost needless to say, Germany is the biggest investor in Iran. At home, Germany is concocting a discourse that has gained momentum over the last few years that is gradually revising history to the point that, while neither the Nazi dictatorship nor the Shoah are negated, the German people are exploited as a whole and turned into a super victim, first of the Nazi dictatorship, and then of the, quote, the Allied, quote, bombing terror. Through such revisionism, it becomes possible to speak of a, quote, special responsibility towards Israel, and at the same time support Israel's enemies. Extremely keen on lifting the sanctions and getting back in business with Iran, European and especially German business people and politicians started traveling to Iran en masse as soon as the supposedly, quote, moderate regime had taken over. Incidents as the following have been laid down by the media. When Stefan Weil, the Prime Minister of Lower Saxony, a land in Germany, visited Iran in April 2016 on a business mission, he met with Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the former president and supposed moderate. Rafsanjani lectured the German politician that the, quote, Zionist had made people insecure with, quote, money and media, end quote, in the 1930s. Then he said the Nazis sent, quote, these people, end quote, to Palestine in revenge, who then created Israel. Weil then interrupted, saying that Germany recognizes its guilt in the Holocaust. Then Rafsanjani countered with the absurd claim that, quote, maybe 6 million Jews were killed, but that this was nothing compared to the 20 million dead and 8 million refugees after, end quote, after the foundation of Israel. Another figure trying to link Nazis and Zionists was Ken Livingstone, former mayor of London, who claimed on a morning radio show a few days before the May 5, 2016 regional and mayoral elections that Hitler had been, quote, supporting Zionism. This before he went mad and ended up killing 6 million Jews, end quote. And that he's, quote, been in the Labour Party for 47 years. I've never heard anyone say anything anti-Semitic, end quote. This was said in response to the question about whether a tweet by Naz Shah, the Labour MP who had beaten Galloway in the 2015 elections, which suggested that Israel should be relocated to America, was anti-Semitic. On the one hand, this opened up a row, and the accusation of anti-Semitism was happily picked up by the right-wing media, especially days before the elections. While the Labour leaders swiftly suspended several of its members, including Livingstone, the left radical press had not much more to say about it than that this was a, quote, witch hunt, quote, demonization, quote, relentless attack, quote, political calculation and destabilization, end quote, and an attack on free speech by the, quote, right and Israel lobby, end quote. The denial extends to anti-Semitism inside and outside the Labour Party. Apparently, it isn't anti-Semitic to say that Zionists are, quote, cockroaches, end quote, who, quote, hide in the dark and try to create havoc where they lay their eggs, end quote. Carol Swartz from Respect wrote that the, quote, slimy, vile, hard-skinned bugs need to be stomped out, end quote, quote. These words could be straight from Mein Kampf. But since she said, quote, Zionist and not, quote, Jews, it's not a problem for the denial left. When the journalist Ben Judah visited Bradford, he wrote in The Independent, quote, a group of passionate Galloway supporters pinned me to a wall, throttled me and punched me in the head, shouting, get out, you fucking Jew, end quote. The Independent, April 28th, 2016. On the street, all this can look different again. For example, an anti-Israel demonstration on April 13th, 2002 in Amsterdam, 15,000 participants from organizations as diverse as the Grey Wolves, the PKK, the DHKPC, stood shoulder to shoulder when slogans such as, quote, Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas, end quote, Hitler, Hitler, end quote, quote, Jews are Nazis, or, quote, Jews are dogs were shouted. These slogans, and there were many more, aptly illustrated the confusion of the anti-Semites today. On the one hand, the Nazis are referred to positively for having gassed the Jews. On the other hand, Israel is denounced as a Nazi state. This is reflected in the view of the Holocaust that is seen by many in the Middle East as something that didn't take place, at least not to its actual extent. At the same time, these anti-Semites suggest that the Shoah should have happened, or should now take place because the Jews are the, quote, Nazis of today. A Jewish person who happened to walk past this demonstration was badly beaten by a mob, only one of hundreds of incidents in the last few years. This situation has only worsened in the last years, whether in French cities where mobs could be heard chanting "Death to Jews" or pro-Palestine demonstrations as recently as 2014. I don't claim or imply that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are exactly the same thing, but most anti-Semitism is now masquerading as anti-Zionism, whether it's coming from the left, the center, or the right. After Auschwitz, the open anti-Semitism that had previously permeated large sectors of Western societies had been discredited. But the thought form had survived. The conspiratorial idea that the world was controlled by a, quote, Zionist occupation government, end quote, on the far right, and an all-powerful pro-Israel lobby on the left and increasingly the center. If we consider the left as a diverse grouping of people, initiatives, movements, and parties that are dedicated to social emancipation and progress, then such a left should distance itself from the kind of anti-imperialist ideology and its anti-Semitic outgrowths outlined above that is unifying such an international front of nationalist and religious movements, no matter what criticisms could be leveled at the U.S. and their allies. This doesn't mean that there's no such thing as imperialism, or that it wasn't right to oppose colonialism. There indeed are a number of competing imperialisms which will lead to war and slaughter again and again if not opposed by a consequent internationalist movement. Of course it was correct to oppose colonialism, but again this, as well as the opposition to neoliberal, quote, globalization, has to be fought on an internationalist platform. Perhaps in 1920, Lenin's view seemed plausible, that by supporting bourgeois revolutions and anti-colonial nationalism in the, quote, backward countries could bring us closer to global communism. But he was wrong, and we're still paying the price. Only an intransigent internationalist perspective, which includes the negation of all nationalisms, religious social movements, and cultural relativism, can bring us closer to future human community called communism. The way there will not be a straight line, but it will have to include a dismantling of the ideological dead weight of the mainstream left, still soaked in the reactionary and counter-revolutionary certainties of the 20th century.